Hello to the War, Peace, and Revolution class. We are here beginning our conversation for this week with Alan Kreider. We are delighted to have him. It's a real gift that he is with us today. Alan is retired professor of church history and missions. He has been actively engaged in interdisciplinary debates that bring his background in history, his engagement in peacemaking, and his time spent in various contexts, both in the US and in England, into conversation and into the debates. He has been thinking about the questions that we are asking for decades. And one of his areas of expertise is in the early church. So that is something that we will be discussing today. His recent publication, is it a recent publication or is it?
It's published in February.
Oh, upcoming publication. So we can all look forward to the book release, is The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. Do you see that there? So we will look forward to learning more about this in the coming months. So for now, what we're going to do is to have two segments with Alan. The first will be an introductory segment in terms of some of the sources, and the second will be a bit more of interpretation of those sources. Do you have a watch on you?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. So, we'd like to begin. We're going to do this in a bit of an interview mode. And so we're going to begin with a word of context. Alan, could you specify the socio-political arrangement in which the communities that we're looking at find themselves? Of particular interest, what was the political entity and what was the relationship of the communities with it? Just briefly.
Briefly, early Christianity spread eastwards and westwards. Eastwards into areas covered by the Persian Empire, and westwards into areas covered by the Roman Empire. However, the situation varied from place to place. The empire was big and it had a tiny government for governing anything that big. And so a great deal depended on what was going on in the locales. It depended on what the local aristocracy was like. It depended on the extent to which local citizens were organized. So it's very hard to generalize about what they were facing. They knew that there was an empire, or there were empires. And they knew also that there were local governments that affected them more or less, often less. The Roman government had a pretty light hand on most people. And so, I mean, they didn't think in terms of the state. That was not a term that I recall them using. Empire they knew about, not state.
Well, that hadn't been developed yet.
That's right.
So there would be reason they wouldn't have thought about it.
Yeah. There wasn't, for example, there wasn't military conscription until the late 3rd century. And so, I mean, a lot of Christians would never have had to become soldiers, you know, if they became soldiers. This wasn't a necessity. It wasn't like the U.S. during World War II or Vietnam or whatever.
Okay, so we'll talk about conscription, I guess, in a bit further along. So can you tell us some of the sources that are often brought to the fore in these debates about the understandings of the early church when it came to questions of war are theologians. Can you talk to us a bit about what we know from the early theologians and what they tell us about the early church?
Theologians' writings survived more than the writings of a lot of lay people because they were cherished. They're precious. People question how thoroughly they represented the thinking of ordinary Christians, as we do today. We know that often lay people disagree with the people who speak in authority in the church. I think that what the theologian said was pretty striking, not least because no theologian prior to the 4th century justified the taking of life. They didn't justify the taking of life at all. They were pro-life, if you will. I mean, they opposed abortion, they opposed capital punishment, they opposed being gladiators, and they opposed killing in warfare. Killing was one of 3 mortal sins. There was idolatry, there was adultery, and there was killing. And so taking life in war would be something that they would not be predisposed to like.
Mm-hmm.
However, another community started to develop. It's along the edge in which Christians started showing up in the military. And this then created some problems for the church.
Mm-hmm.
And they developed biblical arguments for what they were doing. And it just really interests me to see how, let's say, people in traditions that have historically justified taking life in just wars, how they have said, see, the early Christians had 2 positions. And that's true. It was the theologians and the people with authority in the church who had a position that did not justify taking life. And then there were some lay people who started developing a behavior that did justify taking life. And they came up with biblical arguments. There were 2 positions. The question is, who held which?
Mm-hmm.
And they are very different in theological weight.
Interesting. So could you summarize for us then the definition of pacifism? Now, I hear pacifism, from what you're saying, would be a highly anachronistic term. So perhaps it's not even useful for us to talk in terms of pacifism, would you say? Would you venture to offer a summary position of what the pacifism, according to the early theologians, looks like? Or is that an unhelpful question because it misframes your reading of history?
Yeah, I don't find them using the language of pacifism. They didn't have a peace position. They had a Christian position. And the Christian position was that the Christian gospel is a gospel of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And it affected all areas of life. It affected the way in which Christians worshiped. So every Sunday in worship service they had the sign of the peace prior to the Eucharist, which was a time when Christians said sorry to each other before they went to the communion table, because they couldn't worship God if they weren't at peace with each other. Peace was fundamental. They had peace in, if peace did not exist in the congregations, this needed to be elicited and dealt with. Christians were supposed to be at peace with their neighbors. And pacifism as an approach that says we have a distinctive approach to war which has an alternative to killing is not exactly what they were about.
Mm-hmm.
They preached peace, they had a culture of peace, they cultivated peace, they talked a lot about peace.
And so that language is natural to the setting.
It is natural to the setting because it's natural to the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there. And they were entering especially into the sayings and teachings of Jesus, you know, who talked about peace in ways that they quoted at length.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really helpful distinction and important for those of us to keep in mind.
I mean, I'm a pacifist. I use the language, but it's not their language.
Right. But I'm thinking about this because the framing of this binary between pacifism and just war has been so prominent in recent decades for thinking about some of these questions that I think that we're helpfully unsettled to remember that these are our terms that we're taking. And they may be helpful terms, but they also have some limitations.
I think so, yeah.
Now you started talking about the worshiping life of the community, and you have done a lot of work to bring the church orders into this conversation.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us about what the church orders are, and what kind of insight that you find that they offer to these questions?
The church orders are wonderful sources. They are a series of writings by Christians about ways of structuring their common life, which means structuring their leadership, structuring their worship, structuring their processes of congregational life, structuring their prayer life. And these the most famous is the Didache, which is a very early, it's a first century document. Later ones developed, probably the most influential of which was the apostolic tradition, which probably dates from the 3rd century. And it then spawned a number of children that came out of it. Later people altered it as if they had it in their computers, and they kept tweaking the documents and coming out with new recensions that reflect the latest practices. And the neat thing about this is that it governs all areas of Christian life, and it changes across time as practice changes. And so you can use them to monitor Christian thinking and Christian behavior.
Mm-hmm. So, and that then stands in contrast with what you said may be a possibility of the theologians. You said there may be real distance between what a theologian is saying and a description of what communities are practicing. Are you suggesting that the church orders represent something closer to the way in which the community was doing life together?
I think they're closer. Scholars debate this, and some view these as the products of armchair liturgists or whatever. I think they are really pretty closely in touch with the behavior of people. And so, yeah, I mean, they are closer, let's say, to the common life than, well, those theologians were pretty close to the common life. They were killed, for example. They were martyred. You know, they were not only theologians, let's say, at Notre Dame or Harvard or something like that, but they were people who were involved in the lives of communities that were under stress, and they themselves were under stress. So it's not right to compare, let's say, Tertullian with Karl Rahner or with Karl Barth or whatever. Tertullian was in the press, in the scrum, in the struggle. And so I take the theologians seriously as practitioners and as formers of living Christians and living Christian bodies.
Okay, that's helpful. And one more word then. Could you succinctly state then what you find to be the major contributions of the church orders to our understanding of the early church's positions on violence? Particularly here, the question that we're asking is about military violence.
Yeah. First of all, the church orders are comprehensive documents, so they deal with peace on many levels. Second, the church orders change across time, and so they enable us to monitor changing behavior and thought. The church orders have largely been ignored by scholars in this issue. I did an article on it not long ago, and I discovered that the people who write on this subject pay very little attention to the apostolic tradition, and no attention to the apostolic tradition's grandchildren. So they don't trace it across time. So they don't see what's really...
Is this your 2004 article?
This is my 2004 article, yeah.
Okay, then we've read that.
You've read that,
For
okay.
today's class, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to look at the way in which the apostolic tradition then is modified by the canons of Hippolytus, by the Testamentum Domini, whatever. I mean, these things change across time, and that they change across time is a movement from a position in which they really tell Christians not to kill, to the point that eventually they say Christians may kill. They move their arguments in a decisive way. And so let's say between 240 and 380, the church changes its position. Now, if you take the position that they gathered around, which is that of John the Baptist in Luke 3:14, soldiers must not take, impose themselves and be violent to people. It's assuming that Christians are going to be soldiers, and it's saying that they ought to limit themselves. That is limiting people's violence. So it's not a carte blanche for Christians to behave anyhow in the military. But prior to that, the apostolic tradition says, yes, some people may become catechumens. They may be accepted to be trained as Christians. They will, however, be told that they are not to kill. It doesn't say that they must not act idolatrously. They must not kill. And so they are entering a world in which killing is not an acceptable part of Christian behavior. This is absolutely clear. And second, it says that no Christian or somebody training to be a Christian must join the military. And so they are very clear that the military is not a profession that the Christian church honors, respects, or desires anybody that wants to be a Christian to enter. They are aware in an evangelistic setting in which people are becoming believers that are people in the military who are attracted to Jesus, and they want to make sure that they are attracted to the Jesus who says love your enemies and who implies don't kill. So this is foundational to the early Christians. It is, yes, you can come, don't kill, and don't join. I think it's very strong.
Okay, with that, we're going to pause. Thank you, Alan.